Join the only roundtable podcast in compliance with 5 of the top commentators in compliance. Check out the rants and shout out at the end of each episode. Hosted by Tom Fox, the voice of compliance. Everything Compliance is a production of the Compliance Podcast Network.
Everything Compliance is now the award-winning Everything Compliance, having won the Top Talk Show in Podcasting Award by W3. In this episode, we have the quartet of Jonathan Armstrong, Matt Kelly, Karen Woody, and Jay Rosen. The episode is dedicated to ESG. Each speaker will have a different ESG focus, and from there we'll have a discussion around multiple points on ESG. If you're a compliance officer or an ESG practitioner, I know you'll enjoy this episode of Everything Compliance, the ESG edition. All this, shout outs and rants, and more on this episode of Everything Compliance. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Everything Compliance. Today, the gang is going to focus on ESG from a variety of different angles. We will do our normal geographic order, so we'll start with our colleague across the pond, Jonathan Armstrong. Jonathan, you have actually been following ESG for quite some time, but you have been looking at it from a fairly unique angle, I think, and that's the problem of greenwashing. What do you see around greenwashing? What's been the EU and UK response, and do you see that as a solution literally for the rest of the world?
Yeah, I think we're particularly seeing issues at the moment around the energy crisis and ESG combining. And I think this is one of these areas where people almost can do wrong by trying to do good. And I'm thinking particularly of the area of renewable energy. So many corporations are trying to get with the ESG program by making all sorts of announcements about carbon neutrality, about the use of renewable power, we're entirely solar and wind powered for our data centers, etc., etc. But as they used to say in olden days, there be dragons. And why that is that many of these claims, if you like, have gone beyond simply saying we are carbon neutral, and they're almost adding an "and" to it as well. We are kinder to the planet. We're doing our best for the planet. And when you make claims like that, then you're potentially subject to fair trading law across Europe. I think the position in the US is similar as well. So, for example, if you make a statement like that and you can't back it up with evidence, in the UK, the person making the statement or officers of the corporation could be punished by a fine, or in extreme cases, a prison term of up to 2 years. So why might these claims be false? Well, firstly, if you look at solar panels, then a study by Sheffield Hallam University has shown that there's a real propensity of solar panels that you procure to have involved Uyghur forced labor in China. That's partly for the raw materials that make up the panels, and many panels are also manufactured in Xinjiang, where reports of Uyghur forced labor are prominent. And as an example, in Zhuar, the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region, 65% of solar modules rely on one primary material, solar grade polysilicon, and polysilicon manufacturers in Zhuar account for about 45% of the world's solar grade polysilicon supply. At least one major silicon producer has participated in what are called labor transfer programs in China, what other people might call forced labour. And all four of Zhua's polysilicon manufacturers have reportedly incorporated raw material from an organisation that again has forced people off farms in rural China, allegedly, into hammering silicon into small particles to make up the solar panels. So you might say, well, I'll forget solar then, because there are many issues with solar panels. I'll go to wind instead. But in January 2018, ActionAid published a study of human rights abuse in the wind turbine supply market. They're particularly focused on the market in the Netherlands, obviously a big user of wind turbine. And they said that many of the materials used in wind turbines were mined in low and middle income countries in Asia, Africa, and Latin America. And they said that issues with wind turbines could include armed conflict, corruption, tax evasion, forced labour, displacement, destruction of ecosystems, and depletion or pollution of water supplies. They also thought that children, women, and members of the indigenous populations were likely to be being exploited to produce wind turbines. And they said that there had been land grab for wind farm projects in Kenya, Taiwan, Morocco, and Mexico. And again, there are the same or similar allegations about forced Uyghur labour. In June 2021, for example, Apple was criticised for allegedly involving companies associated with forced labour in Zhua in its move to carbon neutrality. So, what about battery? Well, there are similar issues with batteries as well. In this case, the main concern is child labour in Congolese cobalt mines. Biofuels, well, again, there have been big issues over palm oil and sugar cane, which has led to deforestation. There have been issues of migrant labour in India, Malaysia, and Indonesia, and allegations of modern slavery there. There's also been a UK Serious Fraud Office investigation into allegations of fraud and money laundering in the biofuels market. So, in short, I think there are no easy answers, particularly when the legal setup is that if you are making claims, we are the best at ESG, we're kinder to the planet, you're going to have to back those up with evidence. And the preponderance of evidence seems to be that a lot of these alternative sources of fuel are not without their challenges. So, fortunately, it's not a situation where I have answers, but it is a situation where I think it's right that we highlight the risk. We shouldn't necessarily assume that green is good.
Jonathan, what has been the regulator's response to these issues, if any, in the EU and UK?
I think the biggest response from those that I've seen has come from the UK Parliament. The UK Parliament has had a specific inquiry into supply chains that touch on Zhuar, and there have been proposals for new legislation. Obviously, the US has beefed up its border controls, and it can be very difficult for people to import certain types of goods into America, again, because of this reverse burden of proof. The goods, consignments can be held at port, and you've got to prove that there's no Zhuar labour or forced labour in the chain that went to the production of those goods. We proposed new legislation right across the EU. There's a proposed toughening of the UK Modern Slavery Act. So there are many legislative things happening in this space. And obviously, it is not going to be a good ESG program if one of the first acts of the ESG program is the corporation being prosecuted for any of these abuses that are involved in alternative fuel sources.
Jonathan, is the at least a response by a corporation what I've heard you characterize as double due diligence, which is looking once and then looking twice?
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. I think you have to try and look throughout the whole manufacturing chain as well. It's not good enough to say, I'm a US corporation and the panels are being assembled in Omaha, so I'm good to go. You've got to look at the raw materials as well. You have got to look at that complete due diligence on who is selling me the kit and where is that kit coming from. And it is a challenge for most corporations. I know that some suppliers are alive to this issue and are trying to make themselves stand out from the pack by saying we can give you more reassurances about our supply chain too.
Matt Kelly, you have looked at the ESG issue from a variety of angles, but you've been looking at it and writing about it from the SEC angle in terms of now what the SEC has proposed regarding climate risk disclosure rules. Could you tell us what those proposed rules are and what you see going forward?
Sure. So, yes, at long last, we finally have a rule proposal, not an actual rule, but a proposed rule from the SEC to require climate change risk disclosures. The rule is now out for public comment for probably another 50 days or so. There's typically a 60-day comment period, and the rule was adopted, or the proposals were put out on a 3-1 vote about 10 days ago. So you have until probably mid-May, late May to sound off on what the final proposals will be. A couple of different categories of risk and data that companies would need to make under this proposal. So, for example, you would need to disclose the impact of climate-related events and any transition activities to a net zero future your company might be planning to make. You'd have to disclose those as line items in the financial statements if you had actual weather climate related losses, like we lost 10% of our physical assets due to a hurricane in the south, or we lost 20% of our revenue generating opportunities because wildfires burned all our employees out of the home, or something to that effect. But can you tie specific financial losses to specific climate risk events? If so, put them in the 10K or the 10Q. On the annual report, you would need to make some qualitative disclosures around how does the company govern climate-related risks and what are the relevant risk management processes? Is there a committee on the board that thinks about climate risk? If so, what committee is that, and does it have any climate-related expertise? You do not need to, under the SEC proposal, you don't need to have a climate risk committee on the board. You don't need to have a climate risk expert on the board. But if you do, you have to talk about that. One thing that is also very interesting, I thought, is that if the company has a goal to transit to a net zero future, you don't need to have that transition plan, but if you do have that transition plan, you need to talk about that in the 10K. So what is that goal? How are you going to meet those targets? What's the plan? And what supporting data could you disclose year after year to show how well you're getting toward that goal? So again, you wouldn't necessarily need to have a transition plan, but kind of building on what Jonathan's remarks were there, if you are telling investors and the public, look at us, we're going to be net zero by 2035, you're going to have to back that up with real data. So I think that might give some companies pause. And then the big one, the last one, is that you would need to disclose greenhouse gas emissions. Various companies would need to disclose various types. So let me just make sure that I have it all straight here. I have a cheat sheet on my screen. All companies would need to file or report their scope 1 emissions, what's coming out of the chimney at your factories and your properties, how much are you generating greenhouse gas emissions. All companies would need to disclose Scope 2 emissions, which is how much greenhouse gas emissions are generated by the electricity you buy to heat your physical plant, to cool it off if you're down south, to keep the lights on. But whatever energy supplies you're buying, what's the greenhouse gas emissions from that? That's Scope 2. And everybody would need to disclose Scope 1 and 2. And then large filers and large accelerated filers, and non-accelerated filers. You would all eventually have to also disclose Scope 3 emissions. How much greenhouse gas is made by your whole supply chain operation, all of your suppliers, all of the greenhouse gases that might be generated by the use of your product, and so forth. Smaller reporting companies, which I believe it's the revenue threshold of 200 million or less, I think. If somebody has the real facts and figures and I'm wrong, please let me know. But smaller reporting companies would be exempt forever from reporting Scope 3. But everybody else eventually would need to report Scope 3. When would we do all of this? In theory, if the SEC adopts a final rule proposal later this year, then for large filers, you would start gathering that data in 2023 to include it in the annual reports that you start publishing in 2024. So about 2 years from now is when we would start seeing all of that. And that's for the large accelerated filers. Everybody else would phase in a couple of years after that. So that's what the proposal is. There are a couple of questions that compliance officers might want to ponder here as well. So first, you would have, would greenhouse gas emission disclosures, the actual GHG numbers you're putting out, would that be subject to internal control? That's a question that Commissioner Allison Herron-Lee raised. And right now, you would disclose those numbers for greenhouse gas emissions under Regulation SK, qualitative disclosure. Should they maybe move them into Regulation SX, numerical thing like financial data? Financial data is subject to internal control over financial reporting. So Commissioner Lee asked, should we have something like internal control over climate reporting? I don't quite know how that would work. I'm not sure how, I guess, resistant a lot of companies would be, but I think that would be a rather jarring thing if we started having ICFR or ICCFR, internal control over climate reporting. So that's a question that she raised. Second question compliance people would need to think about is how would the audit requirement for greenhouse gas emissions work? So right now there's a question about would this be 1 year of limited assurance where an outside advisor, a climate regulatory auditor, maybe a big four audit firm with a climate practice, would they provide limited assurance that we don't see any big material issues here, seems fine? Or would it be the higher standard of reasonable assurance? The auditor believes that all these disclosures are correct in all material aspects. That's the standard for financial data. Should we have that higher standard of assurance for climate data? Again, not quite sure where that might land, but what will be audited? I think that's going to be and to what standard? That's going to be a big issue people will think about. And then lastly, my other concern is how would these climate disclosures you're making in the 10K, in the 10Q, how would that square with what you are putting out in those very nice, flowery corporate sustainability reports that a lot of companies have put out for years? Because you don't have to, and because nobody audits that stuff, and there's no liability attached if you're saying something incorrect. The SEC does not require sustainability reports yet. But if you have a nice transition plan and you're making all sorts of promises in the sustainability report, would you then have to make sure that that is all accurate and consistent with the 10K and the 10Q and the data you're putting in there? What's interesting to me is that we have already seen SEC staff start to send comment letters to companies. They've done that this year already. Well, you were saying this sort of thing in your sustainability report. So how does that compare to the risks that you've been discussing in your 10K or your 10Q? Clearly, the staff is already thinking about They want consistency across all those reports. And I wouldn't be surprised now if we see that codified in some sort of SEC final rule about ESG disclosures. So that's what we have going on at the SEC. I see Karen Woody. Karen, I knew you were going to bail me out. She corrects me that a smaller reporting company is that which with less than 250 million in public float. So those companies exempt from scope 3, everything else everybody's going to be subject to. But that's what's going on. It's a big proposal, 510 pages. I don't recall seeing a rule proposal bigger than that ever from the SEC. This is a big, big, big plan.
Karen, did you have a question or comment for Matt?
Yeah, my question was about this sort of difference in terms of whether or not you come out and say you have bigger plans for either something like net zero, and how that almost exposes a company to additional requirements. So does it incentivize companies to be quiet and to not say we're net zero or anything like that, because they now then have to follow up on that? Or what's your thought about maybe just saying less?
Okay, well, the cynic in me says that if we push through with this final proposal, then I kind of wonder if these sustainability reports might go the way of the dodo bird. And then a company probably would be wiser just to say, we already disclose all of our transition plans in the 10K and the 10Q. If you want information on that, here's our investor relations site. Knock yourselves out, and stop there. There's no such thing as a corporate financial report, that talks about all the money that you're making. It's what's in the 10K and the 10Q, and that's it. But once the SEC starts treating these climate disclosures as something relevant to investors, I would think that a lot of companies would take a defensive posture here and just say, all we are going to do then is put it in the 10K and the Q. That's what the rules say. And if we say more, then to Karen's point, yeah, there could be some liability. So let's not, and let the 10K and Q and the disclosures there speak for themselves.
Matt, I'm going to tee up a question for you, and it may kind of bleed into some of Karen's remarks. But we recently had, or over the years, we've had judges opine on comments companies made in their code of conduct or other ethics and compliance statements that courts have generally said are aspirational and not actionable from a securities law perspective. We've recently seen some courts begin to say that perhaps these commitments under an ESG formula, sustainability report, or other within the 10K are actionable if a company doesn't meet them or even have a process in place to meet them. Could that be because these ESG or sustainability initiatives are viewed as material as opposed to apparently a compliance and ethics program is not material, but more aspirational. And like I said, I realize that might lead into what Karen's remarks are, but from your perspective, any thoughts on that?
I think that is an excellent question that I look forward to the fact pattern that leads to a court case where we're going to be able to discuss this in more detail. But I would say the only other point that I've wondered about with transition plans and all these promises of net zero, the other regulator that you would have to watch out for is the Federal Trade Commission. And they could hit you with a false advertising concern if you were talking about how you're so great, you're so green, and in fact, you are not making any substantive moves to that, or really you're not as green as what you're advertising. And I don't even necessarily mean great big, advertising campaigns, but more what you're talking about and how you are a good green corporate citizen. The Federal Trade Commission has gone on kicks before where they've cracked down on that. That's I hate to say it, but it's not easy being green, but they want to make sure it's not easy just to say that you're being green. So there's that you'll have to think about as well. But once we start treating all of these promises as material and there's liability attached, yeah, you're going to have to really think about what you want to say in what circumstances if you're a corporation.
We're going to have a quick word from our sponsor, and we'll be right back. Karen Woody, our inside baseball expert, in this case, inside the SEC. I know you've been thinking about a lot of things around these issues, but I wanted to start off by asking you about the process for the proposed rules, how we come up with proposed rules, and then what does the proposed rules mean, moving to final rules. And also, as Matt said, it was a 3-1 vote by the SEC with Commissioner Hester Pierce dissenting. And I think you have some thoughts on her dissent and why, or at least challenging some of her conclusions. So what do you have for us on this?
Sure. I think Matt explained that now that this proposed rule has been written, and the way that that gets written is obviously in concert with a number of different people involved at the SEC, including the Office of General Counsel and a number of other stakeholders that come together to come up with these rules. These aren't necessarily just picked from the sky. They had spent a lot of time working through this, and this massive, as Matt pointed out, 500 some page proposed rule is what they promulgated last week. Then we have about 60 days to comment on it, we being the public. So essentially around May 20th is when the comment period closes. The SEC takes the comments under advisement and reviews them, and then eventually will promulgate a final rule. And so that is what is coming down the pike. So now is the time when we see a lot of the debate via these comments from all sides. And you're right, in terms of what I wanted to speak to, in terms of more of the substance rather than the procedure here, deals with the dissent we saw from Commissioner Pierce and how, well, first as a sidebar, I'm curious to know if any of you all, and the times that you've been following and watching the SEC, if we've always seen a pro forma dissent every single time there's a proposed rule. It does seem like the SEC has become so ideological in terms of the split of the commissioners. And now Commissioner Pierce has only her own self on her side now that Roisman has stepped down. So it's going to be probably a 3-1 on these rules for a while until there's the second Republican commissioner appointed. But that, I think, the fact of that and the fact that we now see a dissent almost at every turn, I think colors a little bit of the discussion and the tone of the SEC. And one that I think is for the worse, in the sense that this does feel like a very ideological, political type space in some ways, which I don't think is doing anyone any favors when we're trying to figure out exactly what it is that is material, what investors care about, what is actually affecting markets or not. And to relegate this to sort of the talking points on various news shows, I think is not helping. But that's a tiny aside. But I do think we need to look at what Gensler's saying in this proposed rule, and then also, which I think Matt did a good job sort of walking through the fine points of it, but then also to step back and look at the broader ideas and scope of this rule. And one way I think to do that is to look at what the dissent is trying to argue is not correct or not maybe within the scope of the SEC's authority. And that is really the big pushback here, that this is not, this SEC is outside of its lane when it's promulgating rules about climate. It's not a group of a bunch of climate scientists over there. So what are they doing in this space at all? And so in this sense, my take is that it's well within the SEC's authority and mandate to be promulgating these rules, because I do think this is material information, and I think it bears directly on systemic financial risk. It would be hard to find an industry that won't be touched by a climate event at some point. Supply chain alone is one where that will be heavily affected. So every industry likely will have some, will feel the climate risk and feel the effects of a climate emergency. So that said, if we wade into what her dissent is, it really does start with, one, we already have these rules. You have to already, under Reg SK, disclose if you under item 303, any known trends or uncertainties that will affect the company's finances. We have item 101 of Reg SK that requires you to describe your business. Item 103 requires you to disclose the legal risks that could be pending. So the ways that you could piecemeal together, I think, is her point of what you need to be disclosing now in addition, and maybe at least a more streamlined way. So she's basically saying we already have this. You already have to do this in some way. So that's one argument. I think we can. I think it's an easy way to debate against that, which is the point of this was to put this in one place, have investors be able to understand climate as its own risk in one type of uniform type disclosure. Her other points of issue here are the ones we hear a lot, which is this is not material information. Investors don't care about this, at least not all investors. And to think of investors as a monolith is inaccurate because we have different stakeholders, we have different interests among the collective that we call investors. And this, I think, I always harken back to what I'd spent a lot of time in both practice and then in the academy now discussing the conflict minerals rule. And I think ESG is a perfect counterpoint to that because conflict minerals came out under Dodd-Frank as a pet project of some of the sitting legislators at the time and became very much a top-down, like, oh, by the way, we're really worried about Congo and what's going on in Congo. So we're going to make every company disclose if they have any product that contains one of these minerals that is derived from Congo. But at the time, at least my argument was like, no one has heard about this. No investors are caring about this. This is not the kind of thing that should be automatically pushed into the securities laws. And I think that actually, thankfully, is no longer the case. People now know what conflict minerals are. I mean, we learned a little bit about them even just from Jonathan's statements earlier. But the ESG is the opposite. It is bottom up. This isn't Congress coming down and saying, we want you to do this. This is, I think, I would argue, an investor-led movement. And again, query which investors we're talking about. But it is coming from the big four. They're the institutional investors. People want to know, retail investors want to know about how green companies are or not. And so I think materiality is met by the fact of where this has come from. This has been a drumbeat from people investing in companies and want to know this. So whether or not you think it actually hits the financial bottom line, it actually gives any information about the health of your investment, I think those debates are old now because the investors are asking for this. One other thing I'll say, because of course in the dissent there's also the other always tacked on, no one's done a cost benefit analysis here. That's always thrown in as a reason not to regulate. And then of course the broad, this actually hurts companies and the economy because it's burdensome for them to do this work. But one other one I wanted to point out that she mentioned that again harkens back to conflict minerals is this trope about compelled speech and whether or not you're requiring companies to say something that they wouldn't otherwise say or want to say. Again, that is a long-standing debate. It's actually the one challenge that had legs on conflict minerals disclosures. But here, I think, at least for this one particular dissent, it seems like she's a little bit arguing out of both sides of her mouth. She says, one, we already have that required as disclosures under Reg SK. But then you're saying, but it's compelled speech at the same time. So it's hard to know which side of that debate she's taking. But I think these debates are long-standing. They will apply to all things ESG, not just climate. They're going to come up again when we see the next one on, name it, diversity, crypto, cyber, any other type of argument. These are the usual debates. But I think here, I would think Gensler has the upper hand. I think this is well within the SEC's authority to do this. So I'll stop there because I could filibuster on that for much longer. But
Matt, do you have a comment or question for Karen?
I have two quick comments. First, I agree with just about everything that Karen said, but one other point that Commissioner Gensler was talking about, the reason why he wants to push ahead with this is so that we have consistency in what companies are actually disclosing. And imagine a world where everybody had to disclose financial data, but you could make up your own accounting standards along the way. Uh, That's not tenable. And right now, everybody and their uncle says that they are an ESG ratings provider, and you can calculate things in all sorts of ways, and it's a big mess. And Commissioner Gensler is not wrong to say that consistency is helpful for investors, and that's what he wants to try to do. But actually, I was more wanting to talk about Karen's points on dissents with SEC commissioners. Um, I absolutely agree that we are seeing more and more dissents from commissioners who are on the minority side, and that is not a new thing. I can remember during the Trump administration, it was the Democratic commissioners who were dissenting over proposed changes to SEC whistleblower rules. But what strikes me is that these days, these dissents really they read like a Cliff Notes version of a plaintiff's motion to dismiss when this gets hauled into federal court, which it will.
Mm-hmm.
That is a sad fact of life here, is that whatever the SEC adopts, somebody somewhere will be unhappy with it, and they are going to haul this rule into court. And increasingly, we see these SEC commissioners on the minority side basically just telling their compatriots in the plaintiff world, this is how I recommend that you file a lawsuit. And you'll see all of this language like we are exceeding statutory authority and various other key phrases and code words that plaintiff lawyers are going to be able to read, and they know what it's about. So as much as we're all talking about this SEC disclosure rule, let's remember that once it's adopted, the next logical step is that some conservative group somewhere will bring it into federal court immediately. What happens after that? I don't know. I wouldn't be surprised if it goes to the Supreme Court. Given this court, I wouldn't be surprised if they rule investors have no rights at all, which I think is what most of them would like to say if they had their druthers. But that's another dimension that we cannot ignore here.
And Karen, I actually wanted to pick up from that point. Could you walk us through the procedure for a challenge to an SEC rule once it becomes final?
Oh, yeah. Well, first, you need to call Gene Scalia, since he made an entire career out of marching through every segment of Dodd-Frank and challenging it. Really, I mean, and it depends where the challenge would come from, but oftentimes you see the challenge even just to the commission, so even within the SEC, at which point when you finally litigate through there, you get bumped out to the DC circuit. That's at least how the conflict minerals rule I think, wound its way up to eventually hit the DC circuit. But it's usually brought by, as Matt said, some conservative consumer group or somebody who challenges this based on any number of the things, as we said, as Commissioner Pierce laid out, one of these. And usually the one that's, again, at least Gene Scalia would do every time was this cost benefit analysis. That's the low hanging fruit. Like, this is going to cost, you didn't look at how much this is going to cost companies here and there. And then we start the process at that point and see how far it winds its way up. I don't know if that answers your question.
So would the suit be filed in federal district court? And could you explain the internal SEC process a little bit?
Yeah. Well, so the SEC, as we all know, is its own little mini country in some way, because it writes rules, it enforces its own rules, and it actually has its own court as well, with an administrative law judge appointed who's an employee of the SEC. And if you bring a suit initially at the SEC, you are heard by that administrative law judge. And if you lose there, which you likely will, because the rules of evidence are it's a little more of a home court advantage for the SEC in their own administrative law court. You then appeal that to the commission itself, and then the commission will issue an opinion. And that, if you appeal, that is the first time you are heard by an Article 3 court, at which point you appeal out to the DC circuit, which is why the DC circuit sort of is the foremost sort of place to hear administrative law opinions, and it's the expert on a lot of this type of issue. So that's one route. Otherwise, you're right, you could bring this as a federal challenge in a federal district court as well. And so I think either avenue is open for plaintiffs on this.
Jay Rosen, you and your colleagues at Affiliated Monitors often write about and perform culture assessments. You've been able to hear the rest of the panel. And so I really wanted to ask you, can a culture assessment, or how would you suggest adapting perhaps a culture assessment to have an ESG focus? And then how would you use that information to help create an overall ESG program going forward?
Great questions, Tom. As we've spoken about this morning, ESG, environmental, social, and governance considerations are taking center stage and are now critical for sustainable success. However, there is one key area organizations may overlook when planning their ESG strategy, and that's culture. As my affiliated monitors colleague Eric Feldman often says, ethical culture is the foundational internal control without which all other controls are bound to fail. Culture is the way things get done within organizations. It's made up of attitudes, norms, beliefs, and behaviors that determine how people show up at work, what they prioritize, and the decisions they make. Getting culture right is essential for any successful transformation. Organizations can invest heavily in ESG-friendly structures, workforce strategies, and governance models, but if they are unable to align hearts and minds and educate the company around the goals of ESG, then unfortunately not much will change. Unlike changes to business structures or operating models, this cannot simply be defined and implemented from the top down. Few people are prepared to alter their attitudes and beliefs simply because senior management tells them they should. Instead, leaders need to give people a say in culture change, asking for input, listening to their perspectives, and involving them in planning. They also need to clarify to everyone in the organization why the change matters and how it puts them in a better position to meet the needs of their customers and society. Weaving ESG considerations into your business so they become a fundamental part of your company culture can be a key driver for sustainable success and even lead to a competitive advantage. In terms of ESG, how do we create the right culture and mindset, engage our people, and reinforce the right behaviors? If a company says they're all about ESG, then they need to show it. Talk the talk and walk the walk. A company's internal policies, processes, and cultures must align with their external communications and how they support their customer base. Is there any hint of inconsistency between what they're saying and what they're doing? Employees will see right through these efforts as inauthentic, and the company could fail to capture the changing customer needs. Oops, hang on a sec. Here are some critical factors to successfully align your culture with your ESG strategy. Leaders displaying personal behaviors that contradict wider ESG messaging can undermine all efforts to drive a positive culture. The right behaviors, such as carrying a reusable water bottle, using public transport, or avoiding unnecessary printing, can enhance your credibility. The wrong behaviors, such as not using the recycle bin, can consequently diminish it. Performance measures drive behaviors and have a big impact on your organizational culture, right up to the leadership level. What behaviors and decisions are your leadership performance metrics driving? Are your measures creating a short-term pressure to perform that stifles innovation and creativity? Your performance measures should encourage employees at every level to be continuously listening to customers and understanding what's important to them. Recognize your leadership team for demonstrating the right behaviors. For example, if you want to drive culture where people can speak up, what happens in practice when people actually do speak up? If your goal is long-term growth, people must be rewarded for making decisions that will pay off in the long term. Any sustainable change starts with a culture and mindset shift. Organizations with staff who are enthusiastic about ESG issues can then leverage this for innovation. The challenge for leaders is to get staff to proactively focus on activities that have a positive environmental and social impact while also being commercially viable so that they can support customers both now and in the future. Company-wide change relies on connecting with people on these issues. Fully embedding desired behavior into your workplace culture is about winning hearts and minds and connecting with people on an emotional level so they can take ownership of making the change. The good news is that the relationship between culture and sustainability runs both ways. Not only can your culture help drive ESG activities, but ESG activities can also help increase engagement with new and existing employees and rally people around your company's ESG goals.
Jay, in the assessment component, well, actually, it was some of your ideas, particularly the senior leadership or the executive level. You talked about basically talking the talk in some very straightforward small steps. I mean, I think you even said drink water out of a reusable bottle. Don't print too much paper. Use your electronic storage capabilities. Is it Are those things that people really notice in a corporation? If a CEO has his own water bottle and takes it to a meeting, is it really something that straightforward?
You'd just be surprised about the little clues that you pick up when we go in and we start doing a baseline assessment for our clients. One of the things that we recognize when we get people together of the same level and they're not underneath their boss and they can freely speak about what really excites them about the company and what also really ticks them off, those are the little things that always come up. And then when you've got a little thing like that, then somebody chimes in and says, that's how it happens on the fifth floor too, or that's the problem we have with the Xerox machine or the water cooler, even though we're not going into work. But those are those little things that really can be so demonstrative. It can really, you pull that one little thread out of the sweater and before you know it, you're holding a ball of yarn because the sweater's falling apart. So those are the things that we see. And those are the things that I think people who are looking to implement change should really look for in their organization and model that behavior, because ESG is not just about these rules that we're saying. And, it's really about, is the company going to be compliant and are they going to create this competitive advantage that's going to help investors and why investors would want to park their money in this company?
Jonathan Armstrong, do you have a comment or question for Jay?
Yeah, I've got a question really, Jay, and I was just wondering, is it? I mean, my guess is it's much more challenging for multinational corporations. I've seen one client, for example, where US facilities wanted to drive some ESG initiatives that those in Europe didn't. I can think of one over the recycling of cans, where US colleagues felt very strongly about it. They tried to implement it, a cross corporation policy, in a really clumsy way, and ended up being threatened with injunction proceedings by the German Works Council. So how do you get hearts and minds across multinationals, across all of their operations, where people think differently about different things outside the US mothership?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, Jonathan. And it becomes really difficult to satisfy those people in other countries and to be sensitive to their needs. And most people here on this group know that before I was Mr. Monitor, I was Mr. Translations. And one of the things I really used to stress was when you were going in and you were going to have a code of conduct that says you should not bribe people, the question that really excited me and got me more into the ethics and compliance part of the house is that I said, look, your employers are not going to comply with the FCPA because it's an American law. But if I'm talking to somebody in the UK, they're going to want to comply to the UK Bribery Act. And if we're talking to somebody in Brazil, they're going to want to comply with the Clean Companies Act. So you need to really get down to use what you lawyers would say, lex loci, or if I pronounced it wrong, but you need to get down to the nitty gritty in each locale that you're doing and give them the opportunity to opine on how they want to attach things. And it makes complete sense that what the US would want to do would unfortunately not necessarily jive with what the German Works Council sees.
Jay, let me pick up on a point Karen raised, which was that ESG is a little bit different than conflicts minerals because it's a bottom-up approach. And she used the example of the investor class who are driving ESG. And that's certainly been one of my observations over the past 12 to 18 months. But it's also being driven by other stakeholders, specifically employees. And employees now want to work at corporations that aren't creating spyware uh, to use by various governments, domestic or foreign, against us, but it's really evolved. And so, is the culture assessment, can it be used to help gauge what employees want to see in terms of an ESG or sustainability type program within a corporation that then can be a part of such a program going forward?
I think that's a great articulation, Tom. And what we see is in terms of just like you can't cram culture down from the top, you can't cram ESG down. So I think that when you're going and doing a cultural assessment like this is an opportunity for management to open up their ears and listen, and then to use those clues that you have onto where you can build consensus and help to have that workplace where people believe in what they're doing and they have an opportunity to choose companies who feel the same way they do about certain ESG issues.
We are now on to fan favorites, shout outs, and rants. We're recording this on April Fools, so I've challenged the gang to incorporate April Fools somehow into your shout out and rant, but it can just be part of your rant or shout out. So, same order, Jonathan Armstrong, what do you have for us for a shout out and or rant?
Well, I've scoured many of the April Fool's jokes across here in the UK. I've even had a brief look at the Poisson d'Avril, because it is so called in France. But I don't find anything as amusing as some of the true stories that have come across my desk this morning. So I've tried to pick one, and I think the one that to me is simply the best is the role of Tina Turner in trying to advance the world of GDPR litigation. So, what's GDPR got to do with it? Well, Tina Turner found out that there was a show advertised, Die Tina Turner story, in Germany. And she said that people reasonably thought that she was going to schlep up on stage every night. But it wasn't her. It was a private chancer, a chancer for money, who was going to stand up on stage and interpret Tina Turner each night. So she tried to sue on a GDPR basis, saying that that was her image and her likeness in the posters, and she could issue a stop processing notice under GDPR. And the case has been through some subsidiary courts in Germany, right up to the Supreme Court, who've ruled against her. So she didn't win this time around, but I think the whole case is somewhat more bizarre than most of the April Fool's pranks I've seen this morning.
Matt Kelly for True Insiders, we're going to shout out to you on Twitter for that. But beyond your Twitter work today, what do you have for us in terms of a shout out or rant?
So I have a shout out, and I'm just going to play it with a straight, normal shout out that I would give any time of year to the Golden Raspberry Foundation. This is that group that puts out the Razzies every year, and that is to call out the worst movie performances over the past year. They come out right around the Oscars as well. I am shouting out to how they have handled this sad news about Bruce Willis having to retire from acting because he has come down with aphasia, where he can no longer communicate very well or understand communicated words. So before that news about Bruce Willis came out, the Golden Raspberry Foundation had created a special category of worst performances by Bruce Willis in Bruce Willis movies because they realized in 2021, Bruce Willis had 8 movies come out in 2021 in that year alone. And normally they would have worst actor in any film. And they decided that because of his prodigious output last year, he deserved his own worst performance by Bruce Willis in a film. And I guess that they thought the competition was fierce, but they announced the winner. I don't remember exactly which Bruce Willis movie won. And then several weeks later now comes out this news that Bruce Willis does have aphasia. That's not funny. And so they announced this morning that basically they realized this isn't funny. We are not going to mock him at all. And they have rescinded or canceled or whatever you might want to say, but they have withdrawn their worst award to Bruce Willis for a Bruce Willis movie because that's just not funny. Maybe his performance had been suffering because he has aphasia and it's a terrible disease. So I wish him well. He had made many bad movies long before aphasia. My favorite worst Bruce Willis movie would probably be Hudson Hawk from way back when, in I think the 80s. But Bruce Willis has also done many good movies. He's entertained people a lot over the years. So I wish him well in his retirement and wish him good thoughts throughout this difficulty that he has. And congratulations to the Razzies for understanding how awkward this is and just falling down on their own sword and saying, we retract everything we've done here. That's not funny. Good for them.
Karen, Woody, what do you have for us?
I have also a bit of a straight shout out, though it involves a little bit of magic, which I guess could be maybe a stepsister to an April Fool's joke. But the reason I missed the last recording is because I found myself in a bit of a crowd at Harry Potter World. So my shout out is to the unbelievable roller coasters that are different from my childhood for sure. Some of the best rides I have ever been on. That definitely gets the shout out. The Hagrid's motorbike ride, which there is no fast pass for, so you are just going to be in it to win it for hours on end, winding your way through a makeshift, I don't know, Hogwarts castle. But then you get on a motorcycle. It actually looks like a motorcycle, and it is hands down the best ride I've ever seen. And it involves a lot of magic, but not as many fools, except for me, because I stood in line for 3 hours.
Jay Rosen, what do you have for us?
Well, first of all, I agree with Karen that the Harry Potter stuff at Universal is amazing. And my favorite thing was the Hulk roller coaster. I have a shout out, and I'm going to stick to the entertainment world. Last week, like everyone here, I was stunned by the slap heard around the world at the 94th Academy Awards. But I've got a shout out to the craftspeople on the movie Dune, which took home 6 awards dominating the technical categories. The film received Oscars for Best Sound, Visual Effects, Production Design, Original Score, Film Editing, and Cinematography. And while this was quite an accomplishment, many Hollywood pundits were surprised when director Denis Villeneuve was snubbed from the Best Director category. This is something I personally called the, quote, movie directed itself syndrome. This is not new, and it happens from time to time. For those who have never been on a film set, absolutely nothing happens without the approval and blessing of the director. We're not speaking only about the auteur theory that the creative vision emanates solely from the director. Just as the chief compliance officer steers the ship from the ethics and compliance perspective, so does the director of this film. While the crew of Dune should be excited with their achievements, let's also send kudos to the captain of their ship, director Denis Villeneuve. And here's to looking forward to Dune Parts 2 and 3. Tom?
So I am also going to incorporate parts of the slap heard around the world in my rant. And my rant is going to incorporate a rather sick joke. So perhaps there's also a tangential relationship to April Fools. But my rant goes to the motion picture, the Academy of Motion Pictures and Sciences, for their abject failure to do anything around Will Smith after he slapped Chris Rock. The day after the event happened, or the incident happened, the Academy said, well, we asked him to leave, but he said no. Well, guess what, guys? It's your show. you can make him leave. Well, then it turned out, in reporting according to Vanity Fair, maybe they really didn't ask him to leave. I guarantee you, if that had been a concessionaire outside who had slapped somebody, they would have been thrown out physically. Now, the Academy is very concerned about this, and they're investigating, and they're going to have a hearing to consider potential discipline against Will Smith. And they're going to invite Mr. Smith to come down and give his side of the story. Well, we all know his side of the story because we all saw it either live, as Jay did when he watched the Oscars, or the rest of us when all of the international feeds saw Will Smith cuss out Chris Rock from his seat. Now, this is a PG podcast, so we won't quote that language. But my question to the Academy is, what are you going to do to Will Smith? Flip him the middle finger and say strong letter to follow. Workplace violence there's no place for workplace violence, and the Academy has allowed this to happen and hasn't done anything. So I hope that the Academy of Motion Pictures and Sciences is a little bit more strident than the NCAA and actually does something to Will Smith, because it set a terrible example, and they are setting a terrible example by their inaction. So, ladies and gentlemen, this has been a great April Fool's edition. I look forward to all us getting together again. And 59 minutes and 55 seconds. Can't beat that. This is Tom Fox again. Thank you for listening to this episode of Everything Compliance. If you're interested in the Shout Outs and Rants as a separate podcast, we now have that available as well, so you can check that out. I'm extraordinarily pleased to announce a new 5-part podcast series on Taxman, the intersection of tax and compliance. If you've ever wondered about the role of tax in compliance, not simply tax compliance, but tax in compliance, this is the podcast series for you. I speak with noted tax expert Tracy Howe on a wide variety of issues such as tax and compliance, why tax needs a seat at the table, transfer pricing, supply chain, and other topics. I know you will find this podcast series very useful and actually entertaining. So please check out Taxman on the intersection of tax and compliance on the Compliance Podcast Network. Also, please check out my 5-part podcast series, Trial of the Century, the Enron Trial with Lauren Steffi, which premiered in January. You can find it on the Compliance Podcast Network, iTunes, or wherever great podcasts are posted. Everything Compliance is a production of the Compliance Podcast Network.
This podcast is a part of the C-Suite Radio Network. For more top business podcasts, visit c-suiteradio.com.